Hello, welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Monisha Machado Pereira. I am the managing partner of McKinsey & Company's Silicon Valley office. And we're here today to talk about what it means when we have declining birth rates and increasing longevity. And we're seeing this across the world, and what does this mean for businesses, for economies, for communities? This is the subject of a McKinsey Global Institute research report that was recently released, and Chris will come up and talk about that shortly. We're feeling this acutely in the Bay Area. San Francisco is the fastest aging society of the top metros in the United States. And a recent San Francisco Chronicle article noted that we have the least children today of the top 20 metros in the nation. And they posit that this imbalance could profoundly impact all aspects of our lives going forward. So that's one reality. There's the other reality that we're in the heart of artificial intelligence and innovation and all the productivity promises that it brings. And could that be the solution to this demographic imbalance? We will be joined up here by a panel of experts who will discuss this. And Chris Bradley will come up shortly and talk about just a little bit about the report, give you a few highlights. Chris is a co-author of the report. Chris is also a fellow senior partner, and he's based in Sydney. He is a director of McKinsey Global Institute, and he has the privilege of leading all sorts of research around the economy, policies that impact industry and leaders worldwide. And so he will share a little bit about his background, introduce the moderator, and tell us a little bit more about the report. Before I have Chris come up, just a few housekeeping items. The first is, this will be recorded, so please silence your phones and keep them on silent during the course of the discussion. You also have cards on your seats if you want to fill out questions, and someone will come by and collect them from you around the midpoint. If you're watching online, please use the YouTube chat. And there are QR codes on either side if you want to download the report. And with that, please welcome Chris Bradley.
Wonderful. It's a real privilege to be here today and talking about a topic. One thing we were puzzling in the green room is how do we end this topic on a high note, but there is one. We'll get to it. So thank you for coming, and we hope to have a very participative dialogue on a topic that really is going to shape our societies. Like, one way I think about it is demographics is like the glacier that carves the path of humanity, and it does so in a very similar way with great power, but also slowly. That means we can study it, we can understand it, but we can also avoid it maybe for too long. So maybe today we'll put that on the table. So 2/3 of the world today lives below the replacement rate. This phenomenon is called ageing, but ageing is really the symptom. The cause is actually fewer babies. When you boil it down and do the maths, 80% of what we call ageing is from lack of kids, and just 20% from more longevity. So Japan went first on this journey. They peaked in the early 70s demographically. China was already below the replacement rate in the 1990s. Seoul, maybe similar to San Francisco, famously has a replacement rate of 0.7. That means for every 2 adults, there will be 0.7 kids. Or let me put that in a way that's maybe more visceral. For every 100 grandparents, there'll only be 13 grandchildren. So the maths, it comes slow, but it's really fierce when it comes. And so, in fact, 2012, in many ways, was a very important zenith of human history. And that was the year when 135 million babies were born, the most that will ever be born in all likelihood, in all history and in all future history. So we've hit peak child. This demographic train it's steaming forth everywhere, but one of the reasons when you look at the world it doesn't seem obvious because these trains are kind of coming at different speeds and with different time horizons to them. So the first wave countries are places where, like we live, Europe, North America, East Asia, Australia, also China. These are places where the share of population that is of working age has peaked. So in this part of the world, where there's about 2.5 billion people, it has 20% of all the world's kids, but 60% of the old people. Right, so this is already a much older world, and the population in this first wave has already been in decline since 2020. So this is an already declining part of the world. Let's think about it this way. Already by 2050, China in many ways is one of these emblematic countries. By 2050, China has less than half the number of under 25s than it does today. And by 2100, has half the overall population. Europe will be down 20%. USA and to some extent Australia bucked the trend by growing a little bit over the century, but as we'll find out why, it's because of immigration. So the second wave are places like South Asia, Latin America and the Middle East. They also peak very, very soon. India is already well below the replacement rate. In fact, a stat might surprise you. Australia's population growth in the last 20 years is higher than India's. So India's already below its replacement rate, and then the third wave is Sub-Saharan Africa. This wave is also going to peak, but it's not peaking yet. It'll peak in about 50 years. So when we look at the world, we go, well, the population's still growing. What's going on? It's because it's happening in these three different overlapping waves. So the first wave where we live is crashing on the shore. This is a reality for us. The maths of our societies, the way we've built up our economies and our social contracts will stop adding up. And what I refer to later as, mathematical proof by contradiction, something that can't be true won't. So our social contracts, therefore, are inevitably going to change and change quite substantially. So let me take you through what the three big implications are. The first one is the growth equation. Gets rewritten. We're used to a world with a demographic gift. So over the last century, believe it or not, the population of the world went up 4 times, but the population that worked in the non-farm sector went up 9x. Why is that? Because people left farms, because we had fertility, and we had a peak of kind of a good shaped fertility where we had lots of kids and then stopped having kids. So and the third F is females. We brought females into the workforce. So this created this huge boom in working life, and none of those 3 Fs are going to happen again. So the amount of people. The amount of work people do in their lives is like an upside down U with age. So in Western Europe, people age 45 do 27 hours of work, but they only do 16 hours when they're 60 and only 2 65 plus. So you lose work quite early in the curve. But Japan, I don't know if anyone's travelled in Japan, you'll see that roles you'd normally expect to have a young person helping you with would be an older person. Their 60-year-olds do 26 hours of work a week more, so a fair bit more. But despite Japan having actual typical productivity growth, you cannot beat this tide. This year, its income will be overtaken by Poland. So it's walking up a descending elevator. So around most first wave regions, this produces a loss of 40 basis points of income growth, 0.4%. Sounds small, but you're talking 40 basis points off 1 or 1.5%. So it's actually a substantial slowing of growth. So if we take Western Europe, it's had kind of 1% per capita growth in the last 25 years. This is made up of 80 points, 0.8 of productivity, which is great. It's made up of about 50 points of people working more, so particularly female participation. And then it goes back about -30, -35 for age mix. But if we think about going forward, that age mix minus, that accelerates like -40, -45. The people can't work any harder. Germany already has the highest participation. Spanish women already have an 81% participation rate. So what it means is growth goes from 1% to like 0.4%. It halves just because of this demographic effect. It's a big pain. So how do you offset that? There's only 3 ways you can do it: productivity, participation and population, the 3 Ps. So for productivity, you need if you just solve it with productivity alone, you need astounding improvements, and that's where AI is going to come in. You need 2 to 4x improvements in productivity. Working harder, In the US, you will get by with everyone working about 2 and a bit hours a week more, but somewhere like Spain, it's 14 hours a week more to make up for the gap. Or you can go inorganic. You can grow the population artificially through immigration. Now, most Western countries have immigration as part of their mix, but to use it as a fix, not just as a mix, you need radical increases in immigration. You need many multiples. In Europe, 2 to 5 times more immigration they have today to solve the problem. In the US, it's 1.5. It's not as extreme. But already in Europe, immigration is the number one concern for 40% of people. So it feels like we're in a kind of a bind between this triangle of harder to get productivity growth, participation, and population. So the conclusion, though, is it's going to be a really tough putt. So AI will be a really big swing factor. The second thing I want to highlight for you is the social contract. So in these wave 1 countries, we have 4 working age people for every person 65 plus. But by the time we get to 2050, that's 2. So our dependency doubles in that period of time. So 2 related issues. The first one is how do we fund retirement? In the US, a 65 plus spend $60,000 more than they earn in labour income. So there's what we call an age gap, $60,000 each. So if you think about that and trying to say, well, how do we measure that across countries? We took that number. So if you take all of the income gap for the older people and divide it by all the labour income of the country. So it's a bit of an artificial measure if you think if we solved all of that consumption just through a tax. In Europe today, that number's 33%. So to pay for older person's consumption, you'd need to use 33% of all labour income. That goes up to 46% by 2050. In the US, it's less extreme. It goes from 26 points to 34. It might not sound much, but that's 8 points of every 8 cents in every dollar that everyone earns. Now, of course, it's not just the government that pays that amount, so it's paid for a combination of the government, savings and dis-savings and investment income. Different societies have different balances. So the US, about half of it is funded from the public purse. One thought is, for this generation who's retiring very comfortably, if you look at wealth statistics in the US, 65 plus they're very happy people. Same in my country, all the consumption growth is there. But they had this thing called a lifelong asset price boom. And so we've kind of gotten used to this thing, old people will be fine. But I don't know if we can do that twice. So the second part of the equation is the tax system. So I already mentioned the $60,000 consumption gap. There's also a $21,000 fiscal gap. So every 65 plus in the US is a $21,000 burden on the state, $21,000 per year. So just from the mix effect, for example, in the UK, just ageing will double their deficit by 2050. It's not quite as bad in the US, but that assumes we keep spending, that 21,000 stays steady. But if you look at the inflation of government spending, it's the age-related categories that are inflating the fastest, so you're going to have a double whammy there. So if you're a young person, I'm kind of in the middle, so I can maybe look with empathy at both. If you're a young person, you've got lower income growth, higher taxes, and you've already paid a lot more for your housing than your parents did. So this is a serious strain on the social contract that we've all grown up with, and the strain on the government purse will be totally unbearable. So therefore, that's my proof by contradiction. What we should expect is dramatic changes in the social contract and in what the role of government is. So I'll do the final two much faster. First of all, I'll do the final one much faster. And first of all, it's just leading to a different world. I talked about these 3 waves. This has really big implications for what the world looks like and what our geostrategic reality is. So this first wave is currently, I mentioned, about 2.5 billion, 35% of the world today, but it's half that share by 2100. It's the third wave. Sub-Saharan Africa goes from 16% now to 34% in 2100. There'll be 2.8 times more people there. In Nigeria today, more babies are born than the whole of the US and the whole of Europe. And in fact, 6 African babies are born every year to 1 European baby. So when you do the maths, by 2100, 2/3 of the world are people who live in Africa, the Middle East or South Asia. So it's a planet that has a completely different take on it. But we're economists at MGI, so we convert that into growth. Just the fact that children are being born into lower productivity countries, because the productivity in India and Africa is 1/10 in the US, so every baby generates their 1/10 the economic output, all other things being equal. Just that alone is half a point a year off global growth. But nonetheless, work is going to have to move where the workers are. So I think there will be lots of pushes to unlock productivity in those places with large labour forces. So we'll discuss this on the panel next, but the question is, can we fix it? And the second question is, do we want to fix it? So on the having more babies bit, can we fix it? Interesting one, I'll leave that to the panel. But, we did have a post-war baby boom, but it was really a blip. If you look at the chart, it's a blip. But it was accompanied with really confident economics, a really big boost in home automation, like life got easier at home, and a really big kick up in home ownership and a kind of a widespread inclusive social contract. Russia's just launched something called the Demographic Special Forces Unit. I'm not sure if anyone saw that in the news. I'm not sure that the Russians are going to be able to compel more babies to come out. But we can laugh at the Russians, but the reality is the record of public policy so far to lift the fertility rate is really a big fat zero. And then the question is, do we want more babies? Some people say no. They say we're already at our ecological limits. But in reality, population is too slow a lever to make a difference. It really, whether or not there's 10% more or less babies isn't going to shift the dial on that. And, I take the line that more people means more resources and more ideas to confront our problems. And that's a really good thing. So this is the new reality we're moving into. We're going to find a way to end on the high note, but I think it's a very important set of changes. So now we're going to explore it in our panel. I'll ask Kaushik Das to come up and lead our panel.
Welcome to our panel. I'm Kaushik Rajgopal. I'm at PayPal, where I lead strategy, partnerships, and ventures. Let me tell you who else is joining us. Susie Cranston is the president and COO of Crescent, a multifamily office and private investment firm. Prior to that, Susie was the chief operating officer and head of wealth management at First Republic. She's also a member of the board of governors at Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Welcome, Susie. Please come up. Noah Smith is an economics blogger at noopinion.com and previously was an assistant finance professor at Stony Brook University, then an economics columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. Welcome, Noah.
Hey.
Since Chris started us off, I'm going to start off with Chris. For years, the dominant narrative on population has been the opposite, probably best exemplified by the 1968 book, The Population Bomb, and the famous first line of that book, "The battle to feed all of humanity is over, and not in a good way." So what's changed, and why didn't we anticipate this trend sooner?
Well, the good news is, thanks, Kaushik. The good news is the optimist won. So when that book was written, 1 in 10 countries in the world were below replacement rate fertility. And so now, as I mentioned, 2/3 of the world are. And, there's a bit of a confusing signal. So the first one is social scientists fall into a really bad trap where they think everything's got an equilibrium. So they had this, basically all the models assumed that fertility rates would come down as people got richer, also particularly with child mortality going down, so you'd need to have fewer children. And then it would settle at 2.1. And why did they say it would settle at 2.1? Because that is the level at which population growth evens out. But there's actually no physical reason why women should magically have 2.1 children. In fact, what we've discovered is that it's really a line that keeps going down, and there's no actual theoretical resting point. So it's strange how that bias was unquestioned for so long. So if you look at successive UN reports on population, they all show fertility going down and evening off. And then when you put the successive charts next to each other and you overlay it, it looks like a hairy back. It's like all these kind of, just constantly wrong. And now they've kind of admitted it. But the confusing thing, of course, the population is still growing. It doesn't peak until something like 2084. So that's the other confounding thing, because at the same time you had the massive improvements in longevity. By the way, the biggest one of that was maternal health and baby health. So for a while, the population grows very, very healthily, even though you've got less babies, because, you know, in a bathtub, you make the plug smaller, you turn the tap down a bit, but the bath is filling up for quite a long time still. So I think they're the main reasons. I also think, kind of back to the population bomb, all of these doomers and people who've touted limits to growth have been proven over the long run wrong, and that's because they have the arrogance of supposing that the only innovation that happens in the world is the one they know about. And the reality is that, you know, there's more, even though there's the population in the last 50 years is up about 2.5 times, the food production is up more than that. And of course, why? Is because of widespread use of nitrogen-enabled fertiliser created, you know, a green revolution.
You mentioned 2084 and, you know, this really experiencing more extreme effects, right, as we get closer to 2100.
Yeah.
The philosopher Yogi Berra famously said predictions are dangerous, especially when they're about the future. So talk a little bit about why we should care now, right? How reliable is this 2084, 2100 prediction? What are the consequences likely to be, and why is it important now?
There's a fair bit of sensitivity in the models of like what the exact numbers will be with death rates. And so, for example, like we've started being able to edit genes in real babies, and like, so if everyone lived to 130, you change things a little bit. And but generally they're variations on a theme that, you know, eventually if you're having less than 2.1 babies per family, the population's going to go down. So that's the kind of, you know, our report's called dependency and depopulation. The depopulation bit takes a bit to kick in. You see in Japan, for example, already I mentioned, is being overtaken by Poland in GDP per capita, simply because it just can't put enough work into its economy. But the dependency bit starts hitting us now. And like, what are the canaries in the coal mine? They're going to be in the entitlement system and in the capital markets. So you will have to start confronting these issues quickly. In my country, Australia, this is the first year where 65 plus has outnumbered 15 and under in entire history. And you only need, you know, fairly small variations to start putting real tensions. And so that's why when you look at budgets all around the world, government budgets, you see age-related expenditure kind of really growing very quickly. So the dependency starts hitting us, but also the lower economic growth, because all of our capital markets, all of our balance sheets, all of our taxation plans are predicated on this idea that economic growth will continue to be very healthy. And touch wood, you know, it will be. But if you just take that 0.5 point of demographics out, that's going to start really hitting the denominator. So the government debt becomes, you know, the denominator becomes smaller, the debt burden effectively becomes bigger.
Thanks for putting that into perspective for us, Chris. So I'm going to now go to Noah and then Susie and get each of your thoughts on your takeaways from the report, how big of a deal it is, how you see the impacts playing out in different countries. So Noah, I'll start with you and then Susie.
Sure. What's the question?
What were your main takeaways from this report?
Oh, I mean, it's nothing we didn't already know. But what's interesting, and what I don't think people really realize, is that there have been two large decreases in fertility. One was when couples had fewer children. And that has been happening for quite some time. And most demographers who think about the causes of the fertility transition think of it in terms of couples having fewer children. In the last decade or so, we've seen a shift where we see people not forming couples at all. And so that is a qualitative shift, and what we've seen is that fertility in some countries paused for a while and then has taken another leg down. And we don't know yet, but it suggests a technological explanation for why people are suddenly not forming couples at the rates that they used to. As for couples not wanting to have as many children, the reasons for that are well debated, and the candidate theory is well known, mostly economic. You know, you don't need a bunch of kids to work on the farm. You don't need kids as your personal pension system, et cetera, et cetera. That's why couples would choose, you have education, greater education, delayed childbirth, et cetera. What we haven't yet talked about. What people are just now starting to realize is that something in our society has caused people to form fewer couples in the first place. And it's hard to see, other than technology, what that could be. So that's an interesting thing that I think not many people are thinking about. A second thing I think not many people are thinking about is the economic impacts from aging that Chris talked about are very real. And the math is easy to do, and it's easy to see how one worker will then have to support more and more retirees, and the burden on each worker in terms of economics, whether they're taking care of parents at home or paying taxes to have dedicated elder care workers take care of the parents, is getting larger and larger. That's easy to see. There's another effect, though, which is that older workforces have lower productivity growth. And that's a pretty robust result in the empirical literature. Aging is associated with lower productivity growth. And so one of the common responses to, oh, we're going to have all this burden is, well, we'll just automate. You know, we'll raise productivity growth and that will compensate. But it turns out that older societies have lower productivity growth. And so that makes it a little more difficult. Now, of course, AI may be a qualitatively different technology. Maybe AI will replace human scientists and human thinkers and all this stuff and just give us fast productivity growth. Lots of people think that. I don't know whether it's true or not. I have no way of evaluating that claim. But the fact that every empirical study we've seen shows lower productivity growth in more aged societies, in older societies, should give us pause about this easy sort of coping explanation where we say, oh, we'll just raise productivity growth to take care of it and it'll be okay.
Thanks, Noah. Susie, what are your takeaways from the report?
Well, I will say, as a mom of two boys, I wouldn't mind if they were my pension plan, but I agree with you, that is not why we had them. And, you know, really, when I listen to studies and reports like this, I'm looking at it through the lens of the families that we work with, and how do you think about planning for your own aging process, your generational wealth transfer. And so, you know, some of the big takeaways that I always come to when I hear research like this are, one, when you think about the declining population and you think about all the sectors where we already don't have enough people, right? And I'm talking about things like, home care for family situations, either elderly parents or younger children. When you think about, some of the shortage, like trying to find a general practitioner for a lot of people these days is really challenging. And so when you think about the shortages that we already have today, combined with, the population decline, what does that mean for families as they prepare for the future? And, we're starting to spend a lot of time thinking about, how do we support people in planning for, taking care of themselves in their old age, right? If they don't have some of the resources and tools that have historically maybe been part of our societal toolkit. The other thing that I think about a lot, and I'm sure many of us in the audience were thinking about, is, when we start talking about the cost of this, what does that mean to not only the security nets that we are used to having, but also to things like taxation and, a lot of the big levers that we think about when we are doing financial forecasts for families. So I think there are a lot of really interesting variables to think about adjusting in some of the conventional ways we think about planning for the future as you start layering in this kind of research compared to just using historical modeling as a precedent for what will happen in the future.
You mentioned intergenerational wealth transfer. As lifespans grow, more and more people are living longer and wealth compounds. And how do you think about advising those families on wealth transfer?
Yeah. Well, one of the really interesting things that's happening when you look at wealth transfer is that, there are a lot of very wealthy families or wealthy individuals, and because they're living so long, their kids are in their 60s, sometimes 70s when they actually inherit the wealth. And so I think one of the big things that we see of interest in our clients, and I think will be increasingly a trend that we'll see being discussed, is really thinking about for wealth planning, what is the goal of your wealth? Right? So, there's a lot of interesting new kind of research and literature coming out around kind of different types of wealth, right? So is wealth really just money, or is it about having the freedom to do what you want with your time? Or is wealth about being able to have experiences with people you love, right? The way people want to see their wealth manifest into their lives is actually very nuanced and different from family to family. And so I think one of the things that's happening more and more is that families are really having to have discussions earlier on and more transparently about what they want that wealth to do for their families. Because otherwise what happens is, you've accumulated all this wealth, but nobody really benefits from it, right? And then the other thing that we're seeing a lot of is, how do we think about intergenerational wealth transfer in a context where there are fewer and fewer children per family, right? So sometimes that means that families have a lot more autonomy to give more away if they have thoughts about how much they want their children to to inherit. And we're also seeing some interesting things around, like, what does that mean in terms of how the families plan to take care of the oldest generation as they move forward? So,
if you flip to the generation that is going to inherit the wealth, as Noah mentioned, people are having fewer children. How do you think about counseling them and what they should plan for?
So I think that, when you think about working with people that are inheriting wealth, the biggest question most of that population has is, well, when am I going to get something and how much am I going to get, right? Because at the end of the day, if you aren't going to be 70, and if you're going to have to wait till you're 70 to inherit money, then you need to be able to live till 70 in the style that you want to live in, right? And so, I think that's where I'm really seeing the emergence of sort of, we call it at Crescit family governance, right? But it is really hard for most families to talk about money, right? I mean, in most places, money is sort of the most taboo topic that you can have. And so it's really hard when families are trying to figure out how to have these conversations, or when the children who are inheriting the wealth are trying to figure out, gosh, is it okay to even ask my parents how much we have or how much I might get? And I don't want to, seem like I'm being greedy or that I want them to pass away. And so these conversations can be very awkward, and it's hard to find somebody you can ask about it, right? And so I do think that you're going to see in families that have wealth, you're going to see an emergence of family governance as a real kind of set of expertise because there are best practices. I mean, we do a lot of this planning with our clients, and there are ways to do this that result in really great outcomes. It's just sometimes hard to find that information.
And optimistically, maybe AI-enabled productivity will enable people to have that lifestyle until they inherit their wealth. But we'll come back for an AI speed round in a few minutes. Noah, going back to you, you mentioned the trend of people forming fewer couples and then choosing to have fewer children. You've also said it's hard to write about fertility. Talk a little bit about why that is and what the current environment suggests for being able to have a dialogue about this.
Right. Well, people don't seem generally really upset about this. Mm-hmm. And one reason I think is the legacy of this sort of population bomb era, where people decided that we want, fewer humans to put less pressure on the environment, and that sort of became part of the progressive canon. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that some people, when you talk about the need for higher fertility, they think it's racist. They think you're like, we need more white babies in this country, whatever. And obviously there is some people who actually do think that. But, telling yourself that concerns over fertility are racist is, for most people, a cope. It's a way of, feeling a sense of control over something that we fundamentally don't have control over yet. It's a way of saying, instead of dealing with this issue, I'm just going to yell at it and make it go away. So, but the truth is that fertility is falling all over the world, and it's not. I know Chris talked about imbalances between various regions, but African fertility is falling very fast. Indian fertility is already below replacement, and so Bangladeshi fertility, I think maybe any day now will go below replacement, and these things and the declines are accelerating. The Muslim world is seeing collapse in fertility, and so that is a little frustrating when people insist on using these old frames, but then people are very, very slow to change the frames of how they discuss public issues. You know, Donald Trump still thinks about trade policy in terms of what he saw on CNN in 1992. And so it's, you know, to some extent, ideas of what constitutes a problem advance one funeral at a time. And unfortunately, and so I just think there's very little urgency, and a lot of people are just furiously, frantically coping, which includes the people, you know, the people who see the problem coming and then wave their hands and say AI will fix it. But then that's just another version of coping with it. The truth is that we don't have a solution to this problem, but we know it's a huge problem. It's coming right at us. It's already here to some degree, but it's coming right for us. We have no idea how to solve it. What we need to be doing is looking for solutions as hard as we can. Now, I can't name you a single well-funded research institute that's set up to study the problem of low fertility. I don't know any. Elon Musk will tweet about it, but tweets aren't going to make people have babies. Instead, Elon Musk could take some of his, I think, $400 billion, whatever, how much money he has, and he could endow a $5 billion research institute to do social science research and experiments and blah, blah, blah. This research is very expensive because sometimes you want to do experiments, you know, and getting people to like have, you know, a lifestyle that makes them have more kids is an expensive experiment. And so, you know, or giving people money to see if they have more kids, or all these things are very expensive. And so they need, if rich people are really concerned about it, they ought to put their money where their mouth is. We need independent research institutes devoted to solving this problem, and we need government-funded research devoted to solving this problem. So we need to conceive of it as a problem very quickly, but instead people are just coping and seeing the easiest way to like wave it away and not think about it.
And you mentioned how this is a consistent trend across several countries, all countries. One of the countries you've thought and written a lot about is Japan. Right. Not just about fertility, obviously, but also broadly about the economy and productivity. Double click for us into Japan. What lessons can we learn from Japan on this? And you know, as we go forward, what can we internalize?
Well, here's an interesting fact. If you take the countries of China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, which do you think has the highest fertility?
I would hazard Taiwan.
It's Japan.
Okay.
All the others are below 1 now. Japan is sort of at 1.2, 1.3. So Japan's fertility fell earlier, but has actually fallen less than the fertility in the other East Asian countries. And so whether Japan is special now is not clear. Whether Japan was special in 1980, maybe so. But I don't know what it was. I don't know why Japan, you know, experienced, you know, they had denser cities, but not so much denser than other places. They had, they got 3G phones before we did, but it was only a few years before we got internet phones. They, you know, there may be very Japan-specific, like explanations that are specific to the institutions of Japan at the time. For example, the corporate system of keeping men in the workplace away from their families like all the time. That could have been it, but that doesn't necessarily help us understand the problem at the global level or in other countries because it's not replicable. It's not, you know, other countries' corporate cultures are not like that. So simply understanding that Japan had this weird corporate culture in the 80s that made fertility go lower than other places won't necessarily tell us what we can do in countries all around the world, from, you know, Nigeria to Canada, to raise fertility. And so I think that right now Japan doesn't look very exceptional.
Chris, maybe to you on this point, any color on the Japanese fertility rebound that Noah mentioned, or other countries?
It's not a rebound, it's just that their curve just went down slower. So whereas China kind of fell off a cliff. Now with China, we have a very clear causal issue of a policy that, you know, it became, you know, children were criminalized. So you see that, but really the important point when I talk about the 3 waves, there's nowhere in these waves where fertility is going up. It's just they're in different stages of the fertility going down. Well, and in fact, if you zoom out enough in our societies, the fertility's been going down pretty well ever since the modern jobs were invented, so at least 100 years. So that's the reality. I think the point that Noah, you make so well is what's it going to take to get an institutional response to this issue beyond, you have some governments trying different things, as you mentioned, even in very hardline Islamic regimes, it's happening. So it's not a religious thing. It's happening in places of all different incomes. It's happening with lots of different social structures, different levels of female empowerment. It's happening all the same. There are lots of countries who are trying certain tax breaks, like, Hungary and France has, and even places like the Nordics, which have had very pro-children policies. It's happening there. So trying to crack the nut of where do you solve this kind of before it's too late, I think is going to be a really important point. One of the things we did in this report was just put some numbers against what the consequences of it are. And it turns into demographics becomes a very expensive problem. So it's actually worth spending a lot of money to try and solve it.
We're going to do an AI speed round now. I just want to let you know that we'll have note cards available shortly where you can have written questions. And after a few more questions, after the AI speed round, we'll curate and ask some questions from the audience. So Susie, I'll start with you. Do you see the potential for AI-led productivity as being one of the pivotal ways out of this? Chris talked about the triad that could help solve the issue. What are you seeing? What do you expect?
Yeah. So I think that, we're still obviously in such early days in terms of AI adoption, right? I always joke that we're in the pets.com era of AI adoptions, if you were here for the .com boom. And I think that AI absolutely will be a massive help in addressing these issues. So, when I even think about, the wealth management space today, there are so many things that the technology that exists today can automate to give back productivity and time and allow, the population of people we have to be much more effective. I think, though, that when you look at use case by use case, the time of when AI will start to really make a difference does vary by industry and by use case. And so, specifically, one of the things that I mentioned earlier that we spend a lot of time thinking with our families about is, how will I get healthcare? How will I get home care as I age? Who's going to help take care of me? And while I do believe that, AI will create amazing robots at some point, as we actually have a client who's an AI robot engineer, and he was talking about the challenge of, it's one thing to get Waymo to drive your car autonomously, right? But it's another thing when you have some giant metal object in your home, if it runs out of battery, it can't fall on the person that it's caretaking, right? I mean, it has to collapse in on itself. Like the innate safety factors that we have to have as part of those, healthcare solution bots is going to be pretty complicated, right? And it's probably not going to be something that we have, in the time frame that we're going to really start needing some improved technology. So my thought on this is that, there's going to be some areas where AI really can deliver and help in the short term. And then there's going to be some other areas where we're really going to have to figure out how to bridge it. And that is going to require some mothers, the necessity of all invention type thinking, I believe.
Noah, thoughts on AI and how significant a force it's going to be in helping to address this?
Well, I think that a lot of people, when thinking about AI, do a sort of an unconscious syllogism in their minds, which is to say that first, we believe in infinite human potential. We believe humanity can do anything. We've solved every challenge. We could just invent anything, do anything. And then, postulate 2 is that AI will be able to do anything a human can do. And so, from these, you can derive that AI can do anything. And AI is therefore a magic technology that will do anything. And the question is only, will it do it this year or next year? And if you, then as for when you try to decide when these things are going to happen, you listen to the biggest salespeople in the industry. How much AI will be able to do, I don't know. I am not really much of a technologist. I have a bunch of friends in the AI industry, but then even they, I would say, have incredibly poor records of prediction. Geoffrey Hinton won the Nobel Prize, and he said we wouldn't have any radiologists by now. We have more than ever, and their wages are booming. But that doesn't mean that AI hasn't improved radiology. As for productivity growth, we've seen a small bump since ChatGPT was invented, maybe a 0.2% bump in productivity growth. That's good, I like that. It's not the kind of 20% growth a year that some people are talking about. how likely that is. I've read all the top people debating, Matt Clancy and Tyler Cowen and all these guys. Nobody really has a structural explanation of why AI would produce 20% productivity growth or 0.2% increased productivity growth. No one really has a good handle on these. Everyone's kind of hand waving and sort of using their folk understanding of AI. The technologists who make AI don't have a good idea of how it can be employed in business. And that is a very consistent thing that happens with new technologies. You see the people who invent them don't know how they're going to be used. And so who does have an idea? If economists and technologists both don't have an idea of how AI is going to be used, I mean, psychics, no one really knows. And so everyone, I can wave my hand with the best of them. I'm got a good hand wave here, and I can say, AI will solve these things. AI, 20% growth a year. Why are we even talking about this? Instead, we need to be talking about robot taxes or something. No, nobody knows. No, just nobody knows this. And so if you're hoping for the deus ex machina of AI, my advice is go on, keep hoping, because that would be cool. All right? I hope that happens. But don't have that be your only plan. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't wake up 50 years from now and say, well, AI wasn't a godlike, magic thing that could do anything and solve all our problems. So our species is dead now. Don't do that. So think about plan B. Think about what are we going to do if we can't just wave our hand and make AI save the day. And I think that is actually my advice across a large number of domains of public affairs right now is, hope for AI to save the day, but do not plan on it.
Chris, beyond being the author of this report, you happen to work at a firm that advises companies around the world on things like technology disruption. And you've written about that as a strategist. What do you see coming with AI?
If we had to put a number, some physical number on what the growth per year could be that we can put our head around, is around 3%. And that's because if we go 10 years out and we just look at tasks done in the economy, and with reasonable adoption curves and technology capability, we see 30% of today's tasks kind of being automatable in a decade. So I
mean 3% on top of what we have now, or 3% total?
No, it's a very naive calculation, but I'm trying to get to what some basis. The naive calculation as follows. Yep. If you can release 30% of work, and I think it's not to use the word replace, because I think it's enhance, release, and that 30% of work can go back into the economy at average productivity, you've just created 3% a year, which, by the way, would be the biggest productivity boom that we've ever seen. Now, what percentage of that 3 we actually get through adoption, and how much does it cost to get there? That's a big question. But I think there are reasons to be. One of the things about the AI that I like, if I go back to the little baby boom we had in all our countries after the war, it had this kind of concoction. I think you might have blogged about this, but this concoction of a technology thing that came along and made life more pleasant and more easy, and particularly made home life easier and better and safer. A sense of joie de vivre and optimism and kind of belief in magic, and a very inclusive economic formula built around home ownership. It wasn't built around welfare states, it was built around home ownership. And so my sense is, one thing I love about AI is just Arthur Clarke has this saying, there's technology, when well developed, is indistinguishable from magic. I do think it's put a bit of the wonderment back, and because we're seeing stuff now and you go, what, wow. And I think that's really positive, and maybe some of that animal spirit there. I know this is the least economically robust thing I'm going to say, but that feeling of, well, wow, maybe there's a new narrative of progress that's there, and maybe that belief itself is as much of the formula. My sense is AI is a genuine new technology platform and a new type of industrial revolution that will have really, really profound impacts. Whether it's enough to get the 2 to 4x productivity you need, on top of it, I know I made the point that a lot of studies do show that in many careers, productivity peaks in the middle age, not at the late age. Some things I like to think in my career I get better every year. I'm not sure.
Bloggers just keep getting better.
You're at 3% annual productivity growth.
Oh, no.
But maybe I'll stick with you on this next question. We've done the technology speed round. Let's do the human workforce speed round. So as someone who's led HR for a large organization, I'm curious how this should inform workforce planning. Is there attenuation of knowledge and talent as workforces age? Like, how should employers be thinking about this?
Well, I mean, already just the demographics of your workforce are much older. And I think in reality, we're going to be planning for longer careers and longer stretches of work. So this idea of like go to university once and pray you chose the right thing and you like being a doctor or whatever for the next 50 years, I think that will potentially be very, very different. If you look at the age mix of older workers, it doesn't take long until you have double the amount of 50 plus people in your workforce. And I think that does have profound implications for how you do training, how you do learning, what the cultures are like. But the funny thing is, in all of these, the biggest problem in many economies, and Anu, who's in the audience, has done a report on this, is not at all this looming wave of unemployment. It's labour shortages. And so what I think it says is this, my sense is the period of labour shortage is probably a sustained one. Maybe in 10 years I'll come back and I'll be like the wrongest person in the world. But the combination of having to create jobs that people really want to do and have to be able to work with workforces that are kind of older and where you're actually willing to take a punt on someone to do a new job who's in their 50s. This is not in most corporate cultures.
Yeah.
In the corporate culture I know, but when you turn 50, I think the clock starts ticking about, when are you going to get out of here? And that's going to have to change.
Noah, what would you say the biggest workforce impacts are likely to be?
On aging, I'd say that one thing that people aren't really talking about a lot is the structure of management within a corporation. So in Japan, you have this very strong norm of seniority promotion. But in fact, you don't have that much more seniority promotion than in other countries. You just have people talk about it a lot. In most countries, people get promoted through the ranks at their companies. That's the way most people get promoted. And then you have a few flashy job switchers, whatever. But then you have a lot of people coming up through the ranks. What happens is, and seniority pay is very common, at least through the mid-50s. And so what you're seeing in Japan is that the upper ranks of management at all these companies are clogged with really old guys who think it's still the 90s. And all the young people want to, they have lots of ideas they want to implement for how to adopt new technologies like AI for, new business processes, new management ways to organize things, new markets to develop and open, and they're just so full of energy and optimism, and they're not in charge because the old people are in charge, and there's just so many old people. Now, of course, young people can create new organizations, but when you have a slow-growing country, when you have a country that is matured at the technological frontier, if you have an older country that's still growing where you don't have that many big corporations, then you can create some new corporations and put young people in charge, and then for a while you're okay. But if you have companies that are, you've basically your country's full of companies, and the only way you get new ones is basically disrupting the old ones. And so then young people can leave and form their own companies and disrupt them, but the old people know who to call in the government to stop them. And this is a problem. And so I think that no one's really quantified that. No one's really looked into that, but it's something I hear anecdotally all the time. And so I wish people would look into that more. So I think that's a thing. The other point I'd make, by the way, shifting gears for a second, is about labor supply versus demand. Now, everybody thinks of population in terms of labor supply, right? If there's fewer people, there will be a labor shortage. Fewer means more valuable. But you have to think of labor demand too. And where does labor demand come from? Well, it comes from employers, right, who want to hire people. But why do the employers demand labor? It's because they're making sales. They demand labor to produce things to meet demand, to meet product demand from consumers. It's consumers. And when you have fewer people, you don't just have fewer workers, you have fewer consumers too. And one very robust pattern that we see is that immigration, even a very large abrupt wave of immigration, causes very little in terms of a glut of workers, because those immigrants who come in buy so much stuff. They're creating consumer demand that creates labor demand, and demand and supply shift together. And so when we're talking about fewer and fewer people, it's almost the exact opposite. Yes, you're going to have less labor supply, but you're going to have less labor demand too, because you're going to have fewer consumers. Therefore, will there be no unemployment? I would say, I don't know, simply because the number of consumers is shrinking apace with the number of workers. And so that's something that I think we should be cautious about.
But consumption does go up with age. That's one of the surprising things in this report. It's a fairly consistent pattern
That is true.
Yeah, it's older, but a lot of it's consumption that's kind of expensive to provide and state provided, like health services as well. So, yeah.
Is that true across countries, Chris?
Yeah,
In rich
it's
countries?
a remarkably consistent pattern.
Yeah. I've got a couple of excellent questions from the audience. Susie, one question for you. To what extent is depopulation and potentially degrowth already baked into asset prices? Or is there a negative surprise coming on asset prices?
That's a really good question. I think that there are a lot of things that are going to be impacting asset prices, but I don't actually think that it is fully baked in, and in part for some of the reasons that have been articulated here, right? I mean, I think, Noah, your point around how does supply and demand shift together is a really interesting one. I actually would be curious. I mean, what do you two think based on what you've seen? Do you think it's baked into the market or not?
I think land is the most important asset class. And that's determined in markets that are not as forward-looking as financial markets are, because it's based on how many people wanted to buy a house that weekend and how many houses were for sale, which doesn't move very fast. What we can say is there's no country in the world with negative population growth that has above inflation house price growth. So it could well be that this thing we're used to of land becoming the store of wealth for most of the world and by far the most important asset class is really just a kind of a funky outcome of a demographic wave. Japan, we were talking about before, when we aside from talking about robot taxation, we were talking about cost of living in Japan. The house prices in Japan are around about, in real terms, less than they were in the 80s. So the thing I think most about is land, because that's probably the most important of all the asset classes.
That's a good point.
Noah, a couple of questions from the audience on the extent to which the difficulty of raising kids is a factor in the choice to have fewer kids. Any thoughts on that? Are there what policies would you say are helpful to do that? To what extent is the difficulty of raising kids a root cause here?
Well, the answer is we don't know. But when we do big experiments, when countries basically, like France will send you a nanny, and of course you can have like child tax credits, child care allowances and stuff. You do actually move the needle a bit, but only a little bit. So, New Zealand did this, and it was kind of temporary effect. But the size of the effect, even if you're being optimistic, okay, the size of the effect we're looking at is, even if you unleash massive amounts of money, is maybe a 0.2 increase in the fertility rate. And, countries are crashing out toward below 1. And so that's a drop in the bucket in terms of what we'll need to actually resuscitate things. So while I do think that these are good and we should do these, I also think we should be realistic about how much child care support and child support economically can and can't do for us. And I think that, also, if you talk about political difficulty, I predict that doling out massive amounts of welfare to anyone who wants to have a baby on the government dime, on the taxpayer dime, will encounter pushback, given that this has been a complaint of Republicans my whole life about taxes. They say, welfare moms. Well, if our strategy to revitalize our civilization and save the human race is welfare moms, then Republicans are going to get really mad.
I will say there's some really interesting research about, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but the idea that, one of the things that they've seen in some countries is that the average number of children per family, like, so once you've decided to have kids, it's actually still 2, right? That once you've made that decision, you are still having the same number of children. What it is the decision to have children, right? And I think that would argue a bit towards the idea that, as it sounds like some of the research you've cited has seen, that, the support there is a big deal. The other thing I would say is that from having looked at what keeps women in the workforce and not in the workforce, which is not exactly the same scenario here, but there is a period of time, which is sort of that sandwich time, right, where you've got younger children, maybe you've got older parents, you've just got a lot of things going on. And I do also wonder, I don't know if there's research about this, but like, how do you help families through these periods that are so intense? Because those are also the peak child, bearing ages, and that is also where a lot of these factors kind of come together to make it challenging to think about doing anything other than just keeping your head above water for a while.
All right, we've spent the majority of the panel on what one of my high school teachers would call problem admiration. Let's come back to the promised optimism that Chris opened with. Why don't we start with Noah? An optimistic thought for humanity on depopulation. How does this get solved?
Well, I mean, optimism? I mean, it's not going to get solved. Okay. We're going to simply keep each other company online as our race dwindles to nothing. And then as our planet whirls around a dimming, cooling sun, we say goodbye to the last human. Anyway, I don't know, man.
That was almost poetic.
Well, it was a little bit of Lovecraft. No, what we need is what we need is research. We need research. Fund the research. I can't tell you what works. I can tell you research spending tends to work on things. Okay, in social science research, you need a lot more money, and it's always a lot more uncertain. But we do find things. We find stuff that works in social science like all the time, and so we need research funding for this stuff. As for what solutions will be, if you ask me to give you my most optimistic case, I'd say technological solutions, because climate change will be solved by technology. Pandemics will be solved by technology. Most, I think, problems will be, like fat, will be solved by technology. It already is. And so then I think technology is our best bet for solving this crisis. Now, what kind of technology would solve it? I mean, obviously, there's the AI does all our work, and so who cares if we age, because there's only a few of us, but we've got AI. It's like a 70s sci-fi show. But then, but I would say that technology that makes it a much better deal to have kids when you're young is what we should probably target for innovation here. So why would I have kids at 22? I want to go out and party. I want to have fun. I want to go to Coachella. I want to, it's not that great anymore. I want to go to whatever the cool thing is now instead of Coachella. Like, I want to do fun stuff. I want to have a life. I want to find out who I could be without, changing poopy diapers at the age of 22. And when, we have people delay childbirth and delay childbirth and delay childbirth, then you get low fertility. It just happens. And so why would people have kids at the age of 22 if they could, if that's like the end of their young, adventurous self-discovery period? The answer is because you hand them off to robots. Now, I don't know if that's a real answer, because I don't know if people will be willing to have kids at 22, even if they hand them off to robots. But maybe some people will. And if you really had very robust, now you can also say things like artificial wombs, although I think that physical pregnancy itself is actually not that big a barrier. I think it's just child care. But then, if you could hand a lot of child care off to robots, then I think that would make child care, having children young, much less of a daunting prospect. And so if you had to ask me, Noah, invent a technology tomorrow that'll raise the fertility rate, I'd be like, robot nannies. Will that work? I don't know, because no one's putting any research toward any of this.
Yeah. Let the record show that Noah had not just one, but 2 thoughts on optimism here: research and technology. Susie?
So this is, going back to where you started, and you were talking about all the research that, 50 years ago was showing that the world was going to be over because overpopulation was just going to destroy the planet, right? And I remember my aunt telling me she thought she shouldn't have kids because she shouldn't contribute to this problem. And here we are talking about depopulation today, right? So I do think that, the world continues to evolve in unexpected ways. And while I know, Noah, you're probably going to hate this answer because, you're like, have a plan, don't just hope for the best. But I do think history shows us that, necessity is the mother of all invention. And so maybe the research gets funded, or maybe the robot nannies do come about. But I do have faith that we are going to figure that out one way or the other. And I think history would suggest that, we will figure something out.
All right. Thank you.
I'm not sitting around worrying. I want to return the world to the rabbits. I want the rabbits to
right.
take over.
Chris?
You should visit Australia. That's where it's happening.
Yeah.
Let's stick with the optimism. Chris.
No, I'm talking about rabbits. Listen, I think the point we make in our report is that the maths of the societies we've set it up now won't work with these new demographics. But we didn't say that to say, oh, well, therefore, let's pack a picnic and give up. I think we use it as a proof point to say, well, the social order will change. And so does it change enough? But because there's so many of the things we've talked about now. So, for example, the really intense period of your career being the same time that you're having children, the norms we have around smaller and smaller, more isolated nuclear families. You write the list of things that we're just taking as fixed here. My view is they're not fixed. And so one reason I like the proof by contradiction is I think what we will do is come up with different forms of social organisation and social life. Maybe they'll even be coded as things like values, but I don't know. They'll be probably retrospectively thought of, but they're really just different structures. So my sense is if the current model is unsustainable, that just means the model will change. And I think so what we should expect is profound not only technological changes, but also changes to societies and career structures. And hopefully my hope is we create all these wonderful things that serve humanity rather than humanity being a servant to it. Our career structures and our corporate hierarchies and things like that should serve us, not the other way around. And, when it comes down to these attitudes and low coupling and everything, like, sure, let's teach kids how to date again, make dating great. I think that's good. But the reality is there's a growing cohort of young people, somewhere by some surveys it's up to a quarter, who just don't think they want it. They're in this population bomb world. They don't want to have children. They don't think it's a good thing to have children. And we have just spent the last probably 25 years telling children that, we're terrible and humans are bad and, the world's going to end and we've got 5 years to fix it. And we have. So I think one of the, whether you call it a cope or whether you call it actually a positive reaction, is reinstilling this joy and hope in humanity. And having families is part of that. It's not the only way to have it. There'll be lots of different diverse experiences. To get 2.1, you don't need every single person to have 2.1 children. You just need more marginal children. So my sense is, my belief, and it's a belief, it's not a fact, is that the social order will reorganise around preservation of humanity. And I think that probably is going to be really, really exciting and really, really positive, and hopefully will unlock a lot of what's great about humanity and help us walk away from some of the things that limit us today and earn our optimism in the hard way.
Thank you, Chris. I opened with a question to you about the population bomb. I'll close with this thought. I was born in India 6 years after that book was written, and at that time, the Green Revolution was alive in India. It led to the quadrupling of agricultural yields, and it was made possible not just because of technology, as Noah and Susie said, but also because of human leadership, specifically by an Iowa farm boy named Norman Borlaug, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for catalyzing the Green Revolution. And when I was a child in India, I heard stories about Borlaug and his team planting seeds while India and Pakistan were at war. While the bombs fell, they planted seeds. That's human leadership. And that's what makes technology and the hope for humanity spring eternal. Thank you.